So, the proverbial wolf arrives to devour the flocks of the boy who cried it. Well, this is awkward. I'm sorry to everyone who was upset by my April Fool's Day prank in which I pretended The Room was based on an obscure Polish novel. In my defense, I thought I'd made it pretty obvious when I got to the twist ending about Johnny being a vampire, and well, not to put too fine a point on it, but the author is just my friend Blue from Overly Sarcastic Productions with a photoshopped beard and glasses. Anyway, the point is, I promise I'm on the level this time. The Room may have been an original screenplay, but The Disaster Artist, the making-of biopic, was based on a real memoir by Tommy Wiseau's long-suffering best friend Greg Sestero, and I am here to talk about how close the film stuck to it. Okay, let's start at the beginning. The Room was a 2003 independent film, funded, written, directed, and starring Tommy Wiseau. It was at first a massive flop, making something like $1,800 back on an estimated $6 million budget, but over the following decades, the film gained a massive cult following of people who enjoyed laughing at how hilariously poorly made it was in every conceivable way, eventually attracting the attention of shows like Riff Tracks and the budding YouTube angry reviewer community. 10 years later, in 2013, the film's co-star Greg Sestero teamed up with journalist and writer Tom Wiseau to write and publish The Disaster Artist, My Life Inside the Room, the greatest bad movie ever made, in which he described his difficult friendship with Wiseau and his experiences being part of such a famously awful piece of art. The book was reasonably successful, winning a few awards for the best non-fiction of that year. Incidentally, Sestero recorded his own audiobook, and it seems to me that he's pronouncing his friend's name as Wiseau, while the internet is insisting it's pronounced Wiseau, but honestly, I'm gonna have to stick with how I was saying it before to avoid stumbling over it the whole way through this video. In 2017, a film adaptation was made dramatizing the events of the book. It was co-produced, directed, and starred human garbage James Franco. Yeah, before we go any further, I need to acknowledge that the man behind today's film is an absolute piece of shit. Since making The Disaster Artist, he's been credibly accused of sexual harassment, sexual misconduct, sexually exploitative behavior, and trying to proposition teenage girls while in his mid-30s. Co-stars of The Disaster Artist like Seth Rogen have publicly stated that they wouldn't work with him again now that they know he's such a creep. Anyway, Franco cast himself as Wiseau, his brother Dave Franco as Greg, before mentioned Seth Rogen as Sandy, the film's script supervisor, Alison Brie as Greg's partner Amber, Ari Grainer, Zac Efron, and Josh Hutcherson as the unlucky actors who ended up playing iconic roles in The Room, and Scott Neustadter and Michael Weber were brought on as screenwriters. The film was remarkably well received by both audiences and critics, who praised the chemistry between the Franco brothers and their commitment to recreating the most famous scenes from The Room frame for frame. It was either nominated for or won a ton of awards, including a Golden Globe for Best Actor, during which Franco blocked Wiseau from talking into the mic while making a speech about how cool it was that Wiseau hadn't let the Hollywood's elite's rejection of him stop him from becoming a star, as he's apparently immune to irony as well as being a complete piece of shit. Right, let's talk adaptation. The following events from the film can all be considered pretty close to how they went down in the book. Greg Sestero, a handsome young man with grandiose dreams of being a famous movie star someday, meeting Tommy Wiseau, a muscular gentleman with a very thick Eastern European accent and long black hair, in an acting class, in which he's impressed by the man's apparent fearlessness while performing very badly, so asks him to be his scene partner for the next lesson. The pair meeting up in a restaurant to rehearse, and Tommy encouraging Greg to forget his self-consciousness and make a public scene with him. Tommy showing Greg around his house and being weirdly secretive about his age and past, and very intense about Greg not discussing him with other people. The dynamic duo making an impulsive road trip to pay homage to the crash site where James Dean met his tragically untimely end. Tommy offering Greg the use of his apartment in Los Angeles while he pursues his acting career, and Greg accepting over his mother's heartfelt objections. Greg actually succeeding in getting signed by an agent, but still eventually hitting a bit of a wall in his acting career, while Tommy's as dead on arrival because of his malevolent look, strong accent, erratic behavior, and complete inability to act. Tommy making the fateful decision to bankroll, write, direct, and star in his own movie so he can achieve celebrity status without having to rely on the existing industry. So, slowly but surely writing The Room and casting Greg as one of the leads. Tommy choosing to buy all of the film equipment instead of renting, as most productions would do, and attempting to utilize both film and video cameras at the same time, simply because no one else had ever done this before, and ignoring the fact that this is because it's wildly impractical and utterly pointless. Tommy making the casting process really weird and awkward by making unusual demands during auditions, and hiring a guy supposedly to record the making of video, but who's actually there to spy on the cast and crew so Wiseau can see what mean things they were saying about him behind his back. Building an executive bathroom for his exclusive use in the middle of the studio and only including a thin curtain as a door. Building sets of alleyways and rooftops despite actual alleyways and rooftops being readily available, racking up huge cost, production difficulties, and awful looking results. Casting a guy several years older than Greg to play a teen boy. The actor playing Chris R going full method and yelling to himself as he gets pumped before takes. Sandy not expecting his check to cash, but being informed by a rather unprofessional bank teller that Tommy's funds were effectively limitless. Wiseau grabbing a rather unusual combination of outfits in a petulant act of pre-filming nerves, filling his pockets to capacity with random objects, and telling the wardrobe supervisor she doesn't need to take a photograph because the continuity is in her forehead. Tommy proving to be absolutely incapable of acting in any way, shape, or form, forgetting even the simplest of lines, failing to stay in frame, unable to combine physical movement with talking out loud, making bizarre creative choices like laughing about a story involving domestic abuse, and continuing to roll around after he supposedly shot himself. Greg coaching him through some of his biggest mental blocks by giving him something to focus on, like an empty water bottle to throw down mid-speech. Tommy's weird obsession with being naked on camera and exposing himself to the entire cast and crew, insisting on an open set and stretching filming out as long as possible. His refusal to provide air conditioning or water for the 100+ degree sets. Having meltdowns on set whenever someone questioned him or tried to have a life or career outside of his horrible, unprofessional production. Wiseau spending goodness knows how much money putting up a giant billboard advertising The Room in central LA. Fun fact, that thing was there for 5 frickin' years, keeping his wild behavior going right up until the end by demanding that his and Greg's limos circle the block a few times before they disembarked for the premiere, claiming the stars of the movie shouldn't arrive until there's a good crowd gathered. Small details, often lost in the adaptation process, were stuck to reasonably well in this film, like Tommy turning up hours late every single day, and literally no one in Greg's life liking his problematic patron one tiny bit. Tommy including 2 title card sequences in his movie because he just couldn't choose between them, and a reference to the fact that Wiseau was seriously considering rewriting the end of the film to include Johnny being a vampire. I also have to admit I was very impressed with the filmmaker's commitment to making human garbage James Franco, who, regardless of whatever else he is a conventionally handsome man, resemble Tommy Wiseau, who is not a conventionally handsome man. I mean, a giant black wig is one thing, but they even went as far as to include his blepharotosis in certain shots. Okay, so I'm going to approach this next bit a little carefully, but in both the book and the film, there's a single reference to Tommy semi-recently being in a rather serious car accident and almost dying, then it's never brought up again. Now, I really don't like armchair diagnosing people, and I could be way off base here, but I can't help but think, from the way this information was presented in the book and the fact that they made a point to include such a small throwaway line in the film, that the implication might be that Wiseau's famously bizarre behavior is at least in part due to brain damage he suffered in this accident. It would certainly explain a lot. You see in the film, and even more so in the book, that his inability to grasp certain social behaviors and perform basic tasks does seem to go way past someone just having a really quirky personality. Again, I don't like assuming things about people's mental health without hard evidence, so let's just move on. I usually like to keep these episodes fairly light-hearted, but there is just no way to make the following information amusing while staying tasteful. You might be fooled into believing that the film's depiction of Tommy Wiseau was a warts and all super honest portrayal of him, because the climax of the film is basically him being such a prick, he pushes Greg's friendship past its limits to the point that they don't talk for a few months as soon as the film is completed. Well, I regret to inform you that the film does not even come close to what I would consider an accurate recreation of the man described in the book. Put bluntly, Sestero didn't write about Tommy Wiseau being a frustrating but amusing eccentric. He wrote about his experiences with a deeply manipulative, straight-up abusive monster whose extreme loneliness drove him to try to control everything Greg did. Like, it's legit pretty disturbing to hear about how toxic Wiseau made their relationship.
I promised myself I would spend the next morning looking for part-time jobs in a new place. Already I could feel that the apartment's old, beloved energy had become warped by Tommy's presence. Tommy may or may not be a vampire, but I can say with surety that at least in close quarters, he's eminently capable of draining the life and light right out of someone. It was as though not having Tommy around freed up all this trapped mental and emotional energy. I was friendlier, happier, and far more open than I'd ever been. You might say that, for the first time in my life, I was acting my age.
This is pretty much the whole book, example after example of Wiseau doing the foulest shit to Greg while depending on pity combined with throwing just enough money and opportunities around to keep the younger man from cutting him out of his life completely. And there's no redemption for Wiseau at the end. Greg just sort of comes to terms with it somewhat and thinks about what Tommy's achieved and what he's done for him despite being a complete piece of shit. Just throwing this out there, this might explain why Franco was so shockingly good at portraying him. Garbage person playing garbage person. The film goes out of its way to lessen this shitty behavior whenever possible. You'll see what I mean as we go through the next two sections. Despite the film's depiction of the big move to LA being a joint endeavor between friends, made possible by the courage and support they gave each other, Greg never actually agreed to live with Tommy. In the book, Wiseau was only supposed to be subletting his apartment to him at a huge discount, while he stayed behind in San Francisco. After a few months, without consulting Sestero, he just moved in as well, proceeding to take over the entire space and filling the apartment with as much garbage as his San Francisco home. He also installed the pull-up bar in Greg's room without permission and started noisily using it at random hours during the night. Any time they got into any sort of disagreement, Wiseau would laud the fact that Greg was dependent on him over him and would raise the rent anytime it looked like his roommate was becoming financially stable. Greg was desperately house hunting from the moment Tommy showed up and, unlike in the film, he was long gone to his own, not nightmarish space long before the room was a thing. So, if he was this done with his shit, why did Greg agree to star in Tommy's movie? Well, interestingly, he didn't at first. A guy called Dave, who Wiseau constantly mistakenly called Don, was cast to play Mark, and they got all the way up to the day before filming before he decided he just had to have Greg in the role. So he offered Greg a shed load of money, like an amount that Greg thought he could live on for quite a while in LA while pursuing acting, and Tommy offered to throw in a brand new car. Accepting made Greg feel like shit because it was screwing Dave over and allowing Tommy more power over him, but it was can't say no levels of money.
Oh! They drove a dump truck full of money up to my house. I'm not made of stone.
In what is apparently very common behavior for him, Tommy later added a proviso that he wouldn't pay Greg 95% of the money until the film was complete, ensuring Greg couldn't leave no matter how long it went on for or how terrible it got, and he had to live off his meager savings during production. Also, not for nothing, Sestero didn't confirm if he ever actually got this huge paycheck in the book. Instead of just being honest about being a dick and firing Dave, Tommy pretended he was just filming some shots of Greg by his producer's request, but after a day or two of this, everyone figured out what he was doing because, unlike Tommy, they weren't fucking idiots. Greg's mother, American in the film, was French-Sicilian originally and had the attitude both of those nations are famous for. Far from being chill and unmoved during their pre-LA move confrontation, Tommy was entirely coward and overwhelmed by her veiled threats of vengeance if he took sexual advantage of her son. Apparently Wiseau's home was a tad more squalid than depicted in the film. One of the biggest problems that Greg had with visiting him and then living living with him later was the very expired food he filled the fridge with and the weeks-old dirty dishes he let pile up on every surface. In the book, Sestero mentions that Tommy insisted on full makeout sessions with Juliet, the young lady playing Lisa, during rehearsals, and insisted they rehearse those scenes so often it became disgustingly obvious he was abusing the situation for the opportunity to kiss an attractive woman. The fact that Wiseau is shown even getting an audition to screw up is an exaggeration. According to Greg, he never got so much as a phone call his entire time in LA. The film also kind of glosses over how much Tommy came to resent Greg's success in the film industry while his own career stayed absolutely non-existent. It's made clear throughout the book that Tommy considered himself just as attractive and just as able to act as his much younger friend, so was genuinely flabbergasted that Greg was getting calls while he wasn't. In addition to remaining naked on set far longer than was necessary for the shoot, Greg suspected that Tommy wrote in more sex scenes between Mark and Lisa so he could watch them undressing each other, which, even compared to the other plentiful examples of his horrifying behavior, is pretty fucking disgusting. The entire crew changed hands multiple times in the book as members either couldn't handle Wiseau's insanity anymore or got better offers from other productions. Unlike in the film, the original crew wasn't invited to the premiere because of their quote-unquote disloyalty. Because they skipped over most of these changeovers in the film, we didn't see Wiseau hurling homophobic insults at people as they walked out. You wouldn't know it from the film, but Greg was apparently performing all the duties of a line manager while also acting in the film. From the sounds of it, the room absolutely wouldn't have happened without him. It was Wiseau's refusal to hire an actual line manager who had time to do the job properly that led to the first director of photography to walk away from the project. After skipping over so much of the abuse that Wiseau inflicted on Sestero in the book, they went ahead and added one occasion of their own, writing in an original scene where Bryan Cranston invited Greg to appear in an episode of Malcolm in the Middle based on him having the perfect beard for the role, then Tommy refusing to give him the day off for it and insisting that Greg shave it off. In the book, the beard shaving was a fairly last-minute decision on Wiseau's part. It also got super weird because the behind-the-scenes camera crew followed him into the bathroom and Wiseau attempted to direct his razor usage? The incident in the fancy restaurant where Tommy accosts a famous director in his usual bizarre fashion and is told to give up on his dreams isn't in the book, but I would honestly not be surprised if this had happened. Apparently Wiseau got the famous "You're tearing me apart, Lisa" line wrong in his first go, screaming "You're taking me apart" instead. No one had the guts to tell him for a few days until Sestero took it for the team. I was sad the film didn't cover the book's explanation of the famous flower shop scene because it's really interesting for several reasons. First of all, this poor flower seller had no idea she was going to be in a movie until Wiseau burst through her doors asking if they could film there, because by this point production had deteriorated into guerrilla-style shooting with the last 3 crew members who hadn't quit yet. Also, the "hi doggy" line wasn't in the script. Wiseau genuinely didn't notice a pug sitting on the counter until mid-take and felt the need to greet it immediately. Greg wrote that he loved this moment because it was the only thing in the entire room that reflected Tommy's nicer side. The film's adherence to the book got a little more sketchy in general towards the end of the story. There's no huge bust-up between Tommy and Greg on the last day of filming. Greg would have been justified in doing so considering everything he'd been put through, but they apparently stayed on speaking terms right up until the premiere. Interestingly, Tommy did tackle Greg in a moment of anger, and that take did get included in the film, but according to Greg, Wiseau attacked him because he said something in French, which is a major trigger for him. This is why the word fiancé never appears in the room, replaced by everyone awkwardly saying future wife over and over and over.
Lisa's your future wife.
Future husband. Future wife. Future wife.
The book ends right as the lights are dimming for the first public screening of The Room, so we'll never know of Wiseau's initial heartbreak that everyone was laughing at his magnum opus, then almost immediate turnaround to accepting his movie as a so bad it's good comedy as soon as Greg suggested it is true to the book and or real life. Personally, I'm inclined to believe that this did happen, but over a much longer period. One of the fundamental differences between the book and the film is, while both are about the making of The Room, the book is Greg's story, while the film is way more Greg and Tommy's story. What I mean by that is, while most of the book revolves around their friendship, Greg still got up to a decent amount of things that did not in any way involve Tommy Wiseau, but the film skipped over this material entirely. For example, did you know he was in a whole-ass film called Retro Puppet Master? It was a direct-to-video prequel and by all accounts, pretty bad, but it was still an achievement in the film industry that owed nothing to his rich friend's vanity project. Interesting side note, Greg didn't tell Tommy where he would be filming, but Wiseau still managed to send a telegram directly to his hotel room in Romania. Wiseau caused no end of trouble throughout the book by adamantly refusing to let anyone see his ID, but he eventually accidentally leaves it in the apartment for Greg to see, and apparently this dickhead was so insecure about his age he had a fake driver's license made that proclaimed that he was in his 30s. The filmmakers chose to lean into the mystery of Wiseau as hard as possible, playing up him avoiding answering any questions about his age, where he originally came from, and where he got the money to pay for the room. Interestingly, the book offers possible explanations for all of these things. Sestero qualifies this part of the book with a warning that because Tommy is a pathological liar, it's impossible to ever be truly sure this backstory is true, but he still recounts what he's pieced together about Wiseau's early life, which apparently started on the communist side of the Iron Curtain before eventually moving to France, then fleeing to America after he was the victim of extreme police brutality there, which is a surprisingly reasonable explanation for his traumatic reaction to the language. Once in America, the story becomes a tad more suspicious, as it's a conservative's wet dream of pulling oneself up by one's bootstraps. Supposedly, Wiseau started by selling knickknacks in a tourist trap, then moved up to being a busboy in a fancy restaurant, then he got a job in a clothing store, and some fucking how worked his way up to owning it, and then a bunch of them. Again, he supposedly made this titanic leap through pure hard work and gumption, but Sestero does make a very, very quiet hint of criminal connections. There's also mention of a would-be wife who would go on to betray Tommy. A real-life Lisa, it would seem. The owning clothing stores part of the story at least was verified, as Tommy shot some scenes of Greg from the top of one of them in San Francisco. Apparently the business was called Street Fashion. Franco and his team also suppressed any mention of what inspired the room besides it being Tommy's weird fantasy life, because while it was pretty obviously largely autobiographical, there were other influences mentioned in the book, the most significant of which being a film called The Talented Mr. Ripley. If you weren't aware, this is a movie about someone becoming so obsessed with a friend's life and wanting to be him, he ends up fucking killing him. Seeing it made Greg really question his friendship with Tommy, and when Tommy saw it, he fell into a suicidal depression and disappeared for several months. He claimed he'd moved to London, but Greg knew he'd just gone back to San Francisco because he'd called him from his apartment landline. Sestero writes about being genuinely terrified for Wiseau's life because he left him so many answer phone messages that were very clearly suicide notes. When Wiseau eventually returned to LA, it turned out he'd worked through his feelings by writing the first version of The Room, which turned out to be a script for a stage play, but had directorial notes as if it was a film for some reason. Sestero describes it as an incredibly warped interpretation of The Talented Mr. Ripley, with the traits of the main characters passed through Wiseau's unique understanding of the film. Incidentally, the character of Mark from The Room is named after the film's star, Mark Damon. In another example of Wiseau being a complete creep, Sestero mentioned he eventually discovered that he'd been illegally recording all of their phone calls for years. When confronted about it, he first attempted to lie, then claimed he was just using Greg's voice to try to train his own accent away. The really messed up thing is he kept trying to do it. Sestero eventually figured out how to tell and would immediately hang up on him. Throughout production, Wiseau apparently blamed every shitty thing he decided to do on imaginary producers and attempted to use consulting with them as a way of escaping anything he didn't want to have to deal with. So apparently there was a brief, altercation between Tommy and Dan, the guy playing Chris R. Despite having promised Dan a complete wardrobe, they had failed to provide shoes for him, and Wiseau had stepped on his new sketches so many times during the scene where they wrestle for the gun, they'd been ruined.
Replacing them was Tommy's responsibility. Dan explained all this to Tommy calmly, but there was an unbreakable steel rod in his voice. Tommy, I think, gulped before saying that he'd have to ask his producers for permission. Tommy, Dan said, not letting go of his arm, I do speeches for $5,000 a day. I run a business, a professional one. If you're really an honest businessman, as you claim to be, and you're really true to your word, as you claim to be, you wouldn't be fighting me on this. Right now, you are being unprofessional. We are very professional, Tommy said quietly. Dan let Tommy go. Good. Then be a man and pay for my boots. Tommy ran his hand through his hair and looked around. ID check!
Tommy, for no particular reason besides misogyny, also fired the original actress for Lisa on the first day of shooting. Replacing her was harder than expected because half the auditioners backed out of the job as soon as they found out that performing sex scenes with Wiseau was going to be part of it. Presumably not wanting to spoil the famous spoon mystery, they left out the simple explanation from the book that the crew had realized that the apartment set looked super bare and bought a bunch of picture frames that Wiseau decided to keep with the stock photos of spoons that they came with. This lazy decision is why hundreds of spoons have been hurled at screens over the years. Final thoughts. This film is very accurate to a lot of things that happened in the book, the core of the story, and the general timeline of events, but I don't know, guys, I just got a very different vibe from the two versions of the story. Maybe not everyone would be quite as badly affected by this memoir as it affected me. I must confess, sorry to get real on you guys, that I have some personal trauma involving emotional abuse that might be exacerbating my reaction, but my gut instinct here is to say that Franco and Co. turned a horror novel into a comedy. Like, I'll say it again, the Tommy Wiseau described in the book isn't funny. He's not quirky, extravagant, or eccentric, he's just horrible. He's a horrible fucking person who tortured Greg Sestero for years and was vile to everyone around him in order to create a vanity project. After reading this book, I'm just kind of pissed that he has the fame and following that he does. He doesn't deserve fans, even if they're laughing at him. Thank you for joining me, my beautiful watchers. I was going to end this with a bunch of rum jokes, but I just don't want to quote Tommy Wiseau anymore. Like, share, comment, subscribe, make merry, and I'll see you next time.
2 is great, 3 is a crowd, 4 or more, you know it's gonna get loud. But don't shut that door, there's always room for one more. Sometimes you feel fed up with this world, like you've been used and betrayed. But if a lot of people loved each other, you know it'd be a better place. So don't shut that door, there's always room for one more.
Much love and appreciation to my patrons of honor, Shelby Holtz, Atel Spurdloff, and Trace Carter. Shout out to Ilnej for the credits music, check out his channel for more parody and original songs, and a huge thank you to this video's editor, Sophia Riccardi. Links to her work in the video description. Sorry, I'm being distracted by this little fucker. Hey, buddy. Ugh, come say hello. Sister, they had failed to provide snookers. Don't know how shoes became snookers there. I think because I wrote sheets on the script, and my mind tried to correct for it at the last minute and just created that non-word. Anyway.